Welcome to the Explainer. So, I want you to just picture this for a second. You're 19 years old, right? You wake up freezing in this damp, dark German forest. You're carrying a rifle, and honestly, it somehow feels heavier than your own future. And hanging over your head is this one inescapable, completely chilling premise. At literally any second, the entire world could just end in nuclear fire. We're not talking about next year or in some crazy distant sci-fi seeker. We're talking about today. Like, what if the apocalypse was literally today? Imagine trying to just process that reality, while politicians, safely tucked away thousands of miles from you, are basically playing a giant game of chess with your life. During the Cold War, you have to remember, there was no massive battlefield glory waiting for you. There was no clear-cut enemy charging over a hill that you could actually see and fight. There was just fear, just this constant, suffocating fear. Because these soldiers, they weren't just prepping for a standard war. They were literally preparing for the end of the world.
Section 1. The Apocalypse on Standby.
Okay, let's dive into this. The strangest thing about the Cold War is that it technically wasn't a hot war. The US and the Soviet Union, they rarely fought each other directly on an actual battlefield, but these troops still had to live as if World War III was going to kick off at any second. And we got to remember the era here. There were no smartphones, no internet, no instant communication to tell them what was actually going down globally. They relied entirely on rumors, propaganda, and some honestly terrifying military briefings. Imagine your commanding officer casually dropping this on you on a random Tuesday morning. If nuclear war starts, you have about 3 minutes to live. That kind of routine briefing constantly fueled this deep existential dread among the troops. Everyone knew the stakes. They all knew both nations possessed enough weapons to destroy the Earth multiple times over.
3. Just 3 minutes. I really want to let that tiny number sink in for a moment. 3 minutes is not enough time to make a frantic phone call to your family. It's not enough time to pray. It is absolutely not enough time to run anywhere safe. When that number is your daily reality, the psychological weight you're carrying around, it's just crushing.
Section 2. Training for Doomsday.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how crazy things got. Because if the briefings were bad, the actual training was pure nightmare fuel. Entire military exercises were built completely around surviving chemical, biological, and atomic warfare. Why? Well, because the government at the time fundamentally believed that a full-scale nuclear war wasn't just a worst-case scenario. To them, it was an inevitability. And this wasn't some boring classroom simulation, okay? This was a real-life, absurd procedural protocol. The U.S. military actually marched troops near actual nuclear test explosions. You stand in the desert, you feel the physical heat from a real mushroom cloud wash over your skin, you watch the sky turn blindingly white, and then your orders are to advance toward the blast zone. They literally just wanted to see if soldiers could still function and fight after witnessing atomic warfare right in front of them. Unbelievable, right?
Section 3. Under Pressure and Underwater.
So, we have to shift our focus to the permanent anxiety experienced by troops stationed at the very edges of the conflict. We're talking places like West Germany, South Korea, Alaska. But listen, if you think the infantry stationed on land had it rough, let's talk about the ultimate claustrophobic nightmare of the era, serving aboard a nuclear submarine. You're trapped underwater for months at a time. No sunlight, no fresh air, absolutely zero privacy. And somewhere out there in the dark waters above or below you, enemy submarines are silently hunting you. American and Soviet forces basically played this deadly, high-stakes game of underwater hide-and-seek. One single mistake meant instant death. In fact, we know for sure that some submarines just vanished forever. No survivors, no explanation, just completely gone.
One stressed commander, one misunderstanding, one bad sonar reading. Because these submarines carried enough firepower to just erase entire nations off the map, the stakes were unimaginably high. A single human error could instantly trigger a global nuclear holocaust. These submarine crews had to live with that crushing, world-ending pressure every single second of every single day. Section 4. Human Tripwires and Top Targets. Now, what's really interesting about this dynamic is understanding the stark contrast between how soldiers from previous generations were perceived by the public versus the total lack of appreciation these specific Cold War troops faced. World War II soldiers, they were celebrated as heroes, right? They had battlefield glory, a very clear-cut narrative of good versus evil, and massive public appreciation. But Cold War soldiers, especially after the absolute exhaustion of the Vietnam War, a lot of them felt completely forgotten by the American public. But they definitely weren't forgotten by the enemy. Soviet missiles were literally aimed right at their bases. They weren't seen as glorious defenders. They were essentially human tripwires, bait. They knew that if World War III started, their bases were the absolute top targets, and they would be the very first to die. Section 5. When humanity almost ended.
Now, if you think all this paranoia was just in their heads, it absolutely wasn't. The soldiers' anxiety was totally justified by some terrifying historical near misses where the entire world basically held its collective breath. Humanity repeatedly rolled the dice with total annihilation. Take the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We were literally moments away from the unthinkable. Bombers were waiting on the runways with their engines running. Submarines were actively arming nuclear torpedoes. And then again in 1983, a Soviet computer system falsely detected incoming American missiles. The apocalypse wasn't just some abstract theory, it was on standby, ready to launch.
During that 1962 crisis, a Soviet submarine commander actually believed war had already started, and he wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo. But protocol required unanimous consent from 3 officers. Only one officer refused consent. One man. And in 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov chose to completely ignore that false computer alarm, bravely reporting it as a glitch instead of an actual strike. Think about that for a second. Single, isolated individuals literally stopped nuclear fire and saved human civilization. Imagine being a soldier on guard duty, knowing your life depends entirely on a total stranger thousands of miles away, managing to keep their cool.
Section 6. The invisible psychological scars.
So, the crucial point is, this is perhaps the absolute cruelest part of the entire Cold War era. Imagine living inside a horror movie where the monster never actually appears on screen, but you still hear it breathing heavily outside your bedroom door every single night. The threat never fully materialized into a global war, but the psychological stress was entirely, devastatingly real. Soldiers suffered from permanent anxiety and emotional numbness, and because mental health awareness barely even existed back then, things like severe depression and alcoholism just went completely unrecognized and untreated. And then, think about the unimaginable burden of the launch keys. Picture yourself sitting in a sterile underground bunker, holding the actual keys capable of launching a nuclear strike. You are literally trained and expected to help end civilization if you're ordered to. That kind of pressure permanently changes the architecture of a human mind.
Which leaves us with this heavy, really provocative question. How do you plan a future when you're busy preparing for the end of the world? When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, millions of people felt this massive wave of relief. But for the soldiers who spent decades standing guard against total annihilation, those invisible scars remained. They lived a life where one wrong move, one bad decision, could have ended humanity forever. What a fascinating and brutal reality to unpack. So if you found this explainer as gripping as I did, drop a comment and let me know what brutal history we should dive into next. Should we cover why it sucked to be a medieval peasant, a Vietnam War medic, or maybe what it was like to live through the Black Death? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next explainer.